What if the most quoted poet in the West was once considered dangerous in the East? What if the man whose words flood Instagram captions and wedding vows was, in his own time, a spiritual rebel who unsettled religious authorities? When you hear the name Rumi, you probably think of love, ecstasy, divine union. But behind the soft poetry and the golden sunsets, there is a far more unsettling story. A story about a mystic who blurred the lines between religion and love. A man who spoke of God in ways that felt too intimate, too wild, too free. Some embraced him as a saint. Others saw him as a threat. This is not the Rumi of inspirational quotes. This is the Rumi who disrupted certainty. In the 13th century, in a world defined by rigid religious structures and legal scholarship, Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi was not supposed to become what he became. He was trained as a respected Islamic jurist and theologian, a scholar, a preacher, a man of law. He inherited his father's position and taught students about scripture, discipline, and obedience. His path seemed clear: preserve tradition, defend orthodoxy, maintain order. Nothing in his early life suggested that he would one day speak of love as the only true religion. And then Shams of Tabriz entered his life. Shams was not polished. He was not institutionally respected. He was a wandering dervish, unpredictable, intense, and spiritually uncompromising. Where Rumi was structured, Shams was fire. Where Rumi taught from books, Shams burned them metaphorically. Their meeting was not just a friendship, it was a spiritual collision. Something shattered inside Rumi. The respected scholar began to disappear, and in his place emerged a poet intoxicated with divine love. Rumi stopped delivering conventional sermons. He began to whirl. He began to write verses that sounded less like legal commentary and more like ecstatic confession. He spoke of losing himself in God, of dissolving the ego, of a love that transcended religious identity. He wrote lines that suggested that the path to the divine was not confined to one tradition. Come, come, whoever you are, he invited, not just Muslims, not just the pious, everyone. To some, this was revolutionary. To others, it was dangerous. Because when you say love is greater than doctrine, institutions feel threatened. When you suggest that divine truth cannot be contained by rules alone, authority trembles. Rumi's growing devotion to Shams caused scandal. Whispers spread. Students felt abandoned. Religious leaders questioned his behavior. How could a respected scholar become so consumed by one man? How could he prioritize mystical experience over established teaching? Shams eventually disappeared. Whether murdered or forced into exile, history is uncertain. But his absence did not silence Rumi. It intensified him. Grief turned into poetry. Longing turned into revelation. Rumi began composing thousands of verses, later compiled into what we now know as the Masnavi and the Divan-e-Shams. His words no longer circled around legal precision. They spiraled toward annihilation of the self. And this is where the tension deepened. Rumi did not reject Islam. He was rooted in it. He quoted the Quran. He prayed, he fasted, but he interpreted faith through the lens of direct experience. For him, God was not a distant judge, but an intimate presence, not a concept to defend, but a reality to taste. That intimacy made some uncomfortable. Mysticism has always lived at the edge of orthodoxy. Too much ecstasy can look like heresy. Too much love can sound like rebellion. Was Rumi forbidden? Officially, no decree erased him. But spiritually and socially, he walked a dangerous line. He represented a version of Islam centered not on fear, but on love. Not on external compliance alone, but on inner transformation. And that shift, subtle yet radical, was enough to unsettle a world built on certainty. And the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that Rumi was not trying to destroy religion. He was trying to dissolve the walls people built around it. He saw religion as a vessel, not the ocean itself, a lamp, not the sun. And when people begin to worship the lamp instead of the light, something essential is lost. Rumi sensed that loss. He felt that many had become attached to the form of faith while forgetting its fire. So he began speaking in a language that bypassed the intellect and struck directly at the heart. He told stories instead of issuing rulings. He used metaphors instead of arguments. A reed flute crying because it was cut from the reed bed. A moth drawn helplessly into the flame. A lover knocking on the beloved's door only to realize the door was never locked. These were not legal explanations. They were invitations into annihilation, the dissolving of the ego in divine love, what the Sufis called fana. And here is where suspicion intensified. Because when someone speaks of dissolving the self, of becoming one with the divine, critics begin to ask dangerous questions. Are you claiming union with God? Are you erasing the distinction between creator and creation? In Islamic theology, that line is sacred. Cross it, and you risk being labeled deviant. History had already seen mystics executed for less. The memory of figures like Al-Hallaj, who proclaimed, "I am the truth," lingered in collective consciousness. Ecstasy had consequences. Rumi was careful, but he was also fearless. He never publicly declared heresy. He did not abandon prayer or scripture. Instead, he reinterpreted them through love. For him, Sharia without love was a body without a soul. Ritual without presence was empty repetition. He once compared religious scholars obsessed with rules to people counting other people's money, experts in theory, strangers to experience. Imagine how that sounded to the establishment. Students who once admired his structured lectures now watched him whirl in circles, eyes closed, tears streaming down his face. Music entered spiritual practice. Poetry replaced dry discourse. The Sema ceremony, the turning dance of the whirling dervishes, emerged not as performance, but as embodied prayer. The body itself became a vehicle for remembrance of God. This was not the cold rigidity many associated with religion. This was movement, rhythm, intoxication. And yet, paradoxically, Rumi remained deeply Islamic. He quoted the Quran constantly. He saw Prophet Muhammad as the ultimate model of divine love. He did not reject tradition. He penetrated it. But to those who could not see that depth, his language sounded universal in a way that blurred boundaries. He welcomed Christians, Jews, skeptics. His gatherings were not restricted by identity. In a time of crusades and political upheaval, that openness was unsettling. Some accused him of softening the faith. Others whispered that his devotion to Shams had been inappropriate, even scandalous. There were rumors, resentment, jealousy. His transformation disrupted social hierarchies. A respected jurist becoming an ecstatic poet destabilized expectations. If someone so educated could prioritize love over legalism, what did that imply about the hierarchy itself? The truth is, Rumi was not fighting Islam. He was fighting spiritual stagnation. But institutions often struggle to distinguish between reform and rebellion. When you remind people that God cannot be owned by any one interpretation, you loosen their grip on certainty. And certainty for many feels safer than love. Love demands vulnerability. It requires surrender. It dissolves superiority. Rumi's message threatened ego at every level: personal ego, religious ego, communal ego. He insisted that the real enemy was not another religion, but the hardened heart within oneself. He taught that pride in one's piety could be more dangerous than open sin, that inner revolution was far more radical than any political uprising. And slowly, a movement formed around him. Not a political movement, not a sect designed to overthrow authority, but a circle of seekers hungry for something deeper than compliance. They gathered to listen, to chant, to turn, to weep. His poetry multiplied. Grief over shams became union with the beloved. Separation became longing. Longing became fire. Yet beneath the beauty, tension never fully disappeared, because a mystic who speaks of universal love in a divided world will always be misunderstood. And the more Rumi's influence grew, the more fragile the line between reverence and suspicion became. Fragile, because mystics do not fit neatly into categories. They belong, and yet they transcend. They affirm tradition, and yet they stretch it beyond its visible edges. As Rumi's poetry spread across Persia and Anatolia, something unexpected happened. The very man who once unsettled religious circles began to be embraced as a spiritual treasure. Time softened the controversy. The fire that once looked dangerous began to look illuminating. But we have to ask an uncomfortable question. Was Rumi truly accepted, or was he gradually sanitized? Centuries later, his verses are quoted without context. His Islamic roots are sometimes erased in the West, while his universalism is sometimes minimized in more conservative circles. Each side shapes him into something safer. A romantic poet, a loyal theologian, a harmless mystic. But the real Rumi was none of these simplified versions. He was far more disruptive, because he insisted that love was not sentimental. It was annihilating. He spoke of being cooked by suffering, of being crushed so the heart could open. This was not soft spirituality. It was transformation through fire. He challenged hypocrisy, pride, and blind attachment to form. He warned that you can memorize scripture and still remain asleep, that you can defend religion and still never taste God. And that is why some quietly feared him. Not because he denied Islam, but because he internalized it so deeply that it became uncontrollable. Once faith moves from external rule to internal flame, it cannot be easily regulated. You cannot police love the way you police behavior. You cannot contain ecstasy inside a courtroom. Rumi's legacy gave birth to the Mevlevi order, the whirling dervishes who carried his teachings forward. They preserved his poetry, his rituals, his emphasis on remembrance. Yet even they had to navigate political realities. Empires rose and fell. Sufism was sometimes supported, sometimes restricted. The dance continued, sometimes in public, sometimes quietly. And still, across centuries, his words survived. Why? Because deep down, people recognized the hunger he spoke to, the hunger to experience God, not just talk about him, the hunger to belong without hatred, the hunger to love without fear. In a world fractured by ideology, Rumi whispered something radical, that the core of faith is union, not division. Was he the forbidden mystic of Islam? Not in the simplistic sense of official bans, but in the deeper sense, yes. He was forbidden to every rigid mind that prefers control over surrender. He was dangerous to every ego that hides behind doctrine. He was unsettling to every system that mistakes structure for spirit. And maybe that is why he still feels alive today. Because the conflict he embodied has not disappeared. It lives inside us. The tension between rule and love, between certainty and mystery, between defending belief and dissolving into it. Rumi does not ask us to abandon religion. He asks us to go deeper than its surface, to risk transformation, to burn. The question is not whether Rumi was controversial in the 13th century. The question is whether we are willing to let his words disturb us now. Are we ready to move from admiration to surrender? From quoting love to embodying it? If this perspective challenged you or opened something inside you, then stay on this journey with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exploration into the minds of the mystics who changed history. Like this video so more people can encounter these forgotten depths, and share it with someone who thinks faith and love must stand on opposite sides. Because maybe, like Rumi taught, they were never meant to be separated.